At 8:32 a.m. on May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens did something no living human had ever witnessed. It exploded sideways. In a fraction of a second, an entire mountainside collapsed. A mass of rock and ice larger in volume than Manhattan slid away, uncorking a pressure chamber that had been building silently beneath the volcano for weeks. The blast that followed raced across the landscape at hundreds of miles per hour and scorched everything in its path. By the time the mountain was finished, 57 people were dead. An entire landscape had been erased, and the United States had just experienced the most destructive volcanic eruption in its history. Before 1980, Mount St. Helens was considered one of the most beautiful peaks in the Cascade Range. Rising more than 9,600 feet above southwestern Washington, it stood symmetrical and serene. For over a century, the volcano had been largely silent. Its last eruptive period had occurred in the mid-1800s, long before the region was heavily settled. To most people living nearby, the mountain felt permanent, stable, and harmless. Even among geologists, Mount St. Helens was considered dormant, not extinct, but certainly not urgent. That assumption would prove deadly. On March 20th, 1980, the ground beneath the mountain shook. A magnitude 4.2 earthquake struck near Mount St. Helens, strong enough to be felt by residents in nearby towns. Over the following days, more earthquakes followed, then dozens, then hundreds. By late March, seismic instruments were recording earthquakes almost continuously, sometimes every few minutes. On March 27th, a plume of steam and ash burst from a vent near the summit, punching through the snowpack. Helicopter pilots reported the smell of sulfur, with ash dusting the surrounding slopes. Mount St. Helens was awake. Scientists rushed in, monitoring stations were installed, and daily flights surveyed the summit crater. For the first time, the volcano became the focus of sustained scientific attention. But the mountain was behaving in an unexpected way. Instead of swelling evenly, its entire north face began to visibly bulge outward. By early May, this expansion was occurring at a rate of up to 5 feet per day. The mountain was deforming, with something enormous pushing from within. Scientists understood the danger. If the bulge failed, the sudden release of pressure could trigger a violent eruption. What no one could determine was when. Authorities established exclusion zones around the mountain, restricting access to surrounding areas. But tension quickly mounted, from loggers with valuable timber at stake, to cabin owners wanting to retrieve belongings, to local residents convinced the danger was being exaggerated. Over time, boundaries shifted, limited access was granted, and some areas reopened. Among those allowed near the mountain was David Johnston, a young volcanologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Johnston was stationed at an observation post known as Coldwater 2, just 6 miles north of the summit. He knew the risk, but he stayed anyway. As April turned into May, Mount St. Helens became a study in restraint, both human and geological. Each day, scientists measured the bulge, watching it swell outward inch by inch, then foot by foot. Instruments confirmed what the eye could already see. The mountain was deforming at a pace no volcano in the continental United States had ever shown. Yet the eruption did not come. Days passed, then weeks. Every morning without an explosion brought uneasy relief, followed by growing doubt. Some officials began to question whether the danger had been overstated. The longer nothing happened, the harder it became to justify strict closures. People wanted certainty scientists could not provide. The truth was simple and uncomfortable. Volcanoes do not operate on human schedules. Seismic activity fluctuated, gas emissions rose and fell, and the protrusion continued to grow, but unevenly and unpredictably. Some scientists feared a catastrophic eruption. Others believed the mountain might gradually release pressure through smaller explosions. No one knew which outcome awaited. One of the greatest challenges facing scientists was the absence of comparison. The historical record was incomplete. Privately, some volcanologists worried the bulge could fail catastrophically, triggering a lateral blast, an eruption moving outward rather than upward. Emergency plans and hazard maps were based on vertical eruptions, assuming the danger would radiate outward evenly. They did not account for a sideways blast moving hundreds of miles per hour. The mountain was changing faster than understanding could keep up. As weeks passed, a subtle shift occurred, not in the volcano, but in the people watching it. Familiarity bred comfort. Earthquakes became background noise, steam plumes became routine, and the bulge, once alarming, became expected. On May 17th, the day before the eruption, scientists reviewed data showing continued deformation and seismic instability. Nothing suggested safety, and nothing suggested immediacy either. The next morning, at 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath Mount St. Helens. That quake was the trigger. In less than 10 seconds, the entire north face of the volcano collapsed in the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. Billions of tons of rock and ice slid away, instantly exposing the pressurized magma chamber inside. What followed was not a traditional eruption. It was a lateral blast. Superheated gas, ash, and rock exploded sideways at speeds up to 670 miles per hour, overtaking everything in its path, with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Forests were flattened in seconds, and trees snapped at their bases, laid down in a radial pattern pointing away from the mountain. From his observation point, David Johnston radioed a final message. He was never found. The blast zone extended across 230 square miles. Spirit Lake was lifted violently from its basin, sloshing against its shores and carrying thousands of trees back into the water. Valleys were stripped bare as rivers were choked with ash and debris, triggering massive mud flows known as lahars. Some traveled more than 50 miles downstream, destroying bridges, highways, and communities far from the volcano itself. Above it all, Mount St. Helens continued to erupt, but now vertically, sending an ash column more than 15 miles into the atmosphere. 57 people lost their lives. They included scientists, photographers, campers, and residents who underestimated the danger or refused to leave. Some were overtaken by the blast itself. Others were caught in lahars or suffocated by ash. Many were never recovered. The eruption caused more than $1 billion in damage, destroyed over 200 homes, and leveled vast tracts of commercially valuable forest. At the time, lateral blasts were poorly understood. While theorized, no modern eruption had demonstrated their full destructive potential. The collapse of the north flank transformed volcanology overnight. Volcanoes were no longer just vertical threats, they were directional ones. In the years that followed, Mount St. Helens continued to erupt intermittently, building a lava dome within its shattered crater. The surrounding landscape, once thought permanently destroyed, slowly returned. Plants emerged from ash, animals followed, and Spirit Lake stabilized. Scientists studied the recovery closely, turning the blast zone into a living laboratory of ecological resilience. In 1982, Congress designated the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument, preserving the site as both memorial and warning. The volcano remains active today. Quieter, but not finished. The eruption fundamentally changed how volcanoes are monitored. It led to improved seismic networks, better hazard modeling, and more cautious evacuation policies. It forced emergency planners to confront uncertainty and to act earlier rather than later. Most importantly, it delivered a humbling lesson. Warnings do not always look dramatic. Danger does not always arrive loudly. And certainty is often the most dangerous assumption of all. Today, the mountain stands reshaped, its summit torn away, its symmetry gone forever, but its message remains. Mount St. Helens did not just erupt. It reminded the world who's in control. Thank you everybody for watching. I make new videos every week, so if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd appreciate the support.